Okay, welcome back to week 2 of American Lit 4. Hope you were able to get through all of the readings and the videos of last week. No worries, do the best you can. It was kind of a heavy load to start off, so we'll just get our way through it. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the reasoning behind the course. All it really is not so much an analytical breakdown of stories. We'll leave that for the PhD students. We really just want to try to provide you with an overview of some selected works in American literature. We're starting off in the past, but we're very quickly getting more into contemporary materials. And I'd like to just see you through this experience, gather an interest in reading American literature, not only for this course, but for your own reading enjoyment. Any of you who are English language majors, looking at either studying or working in the American environment. These are all backdrops that will be useful for you in the future. So, in addition to taking a course like this and doing some reading on your own, through technology of Facebook and Twitter, there are several American literature groups that you can join. Their posts are reviews of contemporary books and novels and stories that have been recently published, and overview of what's trending in America today. So lots of good posts on both the Facebook and the Twitter American literature groups. So if you decide to join one or more of them, send me an email, tell me which one you join, extra points. Okay, so we're just trying to get you interested in continuing your pleasure reading. Take a look at American literature as an option. Okay, so let's get into our story. Jack London's Keesh. Just a couple of background notes that we didn't talk about last time. So this is what Jack London's world view was at the time. And as we know, authors from different time periods write about that worldview. So let's take a look at what Jack was looking at. He's born in 1867. That's just 2 years after the completion of the American Civil War. Very difficult time in American history. There were in the streets and in your neighborhood and everywhere you looked, there were men who came back from the war who were broken, wounded. This was not a pretty sight to behold in American historical time. A lot of people that relied on their families, their parents, their fathers, didn't come back. And so poverty and loss of real estate and farms was very common. Still a very tumultuous time in America. And Jack London is born right in the middle of that. So this is what he saw on a daily basis. Also, if you take a look at the map of America during that time, you can see there's a lot of open space. These are not states, they're territories. This is at the time of a westward migration of people looking for cheap land for farming or raising cattle. And of course, this was mostly indigenous people's land at that time. So there's always a conflict. Uh, we take a look at Hawaii. Hawaii is called the Kingdom of Hawaii. Well, the Hawaiians didn't call it a kingdom themselves. That was just a colonial title it was given. And Alaska is owned by Russia during that time. And as we can see toward the end of his life, the technology of the day has progressed to the point where there are few horse and buggy, and the new thing on the streets of Manhattan in New York is the automobile. So Jack London saw this whole transition of history during his lifetime, and it absolutely affected his work and his writing. So Jack London is a writer of what's called the naturalism movement. His work was different than other naturalist writers due to his subject matter. So London goes to the Yukon, which is a territory in Canada right next to Alaska. And it's part of the Klondike Gold Rush. He was 21 years of age. And this experience influenced his writing to the point where most of his work explores various parts of life in the far north. Keesh is one of his stories. His two most famous stories, one called White Fang and the other called Call of the Wild, both about life in the far north. So London wrote in the style of naturalism about a part of the world that most of his readers would never experience. And this is one of the reasons that his works were so successful. It allows the reader to connect with experiences very different from their own in continental United States, in urban areas, and so forth. So this is what made him so popular as a writer in his own lifetime. And he was one of the few authors that actually became popular while they were still alive. Most authors, artists, musicians really become popular after they pass on. So he was lucky. He goes up to the Yukon to find his riches and treasures, and fame, and he fails. He gets very sick while he's up there. He has to return. And at this point, returning to San Francisco, some of his family members, he has to step up to the plate and be the supporter, the financial supporter for his family. And he tries a number of different odd jobs and just really doesn't make enough money, doesn't do well. So he turns to writing, and he would write 5 pages, 1,000 words a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, just to create his own writing style. And it pays off for him handsomely. He does find his treasure, not in the gold rush, but in his publications. Okay, so back to realism, the literary form of realism that was in vogue at the time of Jack London. So naturalism is a literary movement that attempts to portray realistic situations, often with a pessimistic and detached tone to it. Some of the characteristics of naturalism might be determinism, scientific objectivism, social commentary. It bases its literary works upon things that can be seen, what is viewed as natural and earthly. But naturalism is an extension of something called realism. And traits of realism are people in their lives are often deeply affected by natural forces such as heredity, the environment, and even chance. People cannot control such forces, but they must carry on the best that they can. So the root of this naturalism really comes from what is on everyone's lips at the time is Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. This shakes up the whole scientific world. Everybody's talking about it, and it extends even to the literature of the day. Okay, so when we take a look at Keesh and we read the story, we're going to find some older English language expressions. A couple of them are no man may venture forth, thou hast a wife, for her dost thou speak. Shall the babes in arms tell us men the things that we shall do? Hear me, ye men, he cried. These are old English formulaic writing patterns. We saw a lot of that in Ben Franklin's remarks, probably even more so in Roger Williams' work. So, of course, Roger Williams' poem was written during the early colonial period. We jump in our time machine and we go to Ben Franklin's remarks 100 years later. We still see this same form of English language. And now we're 100 years after Ben, and we're into Jack London's writing style. So you can see through time, less and less of these old English phrases and vocabulary are used. Not 100% gone, but we're getting there. So let's talk a little bit about the American language. After the Revolutionary War, of course, America hated England after the war. There was even talk of changing the official language from English to Latin or Greek or even Hebrew. And they looked at how much it would cost to do that and said, well, that's not such a great idea. Let's stick with English. But as time goes by, especially after the War of 1812, America starts coming into its own identity. It's not the colonial possession that it was before. 1806, the first American English dictionary is published. A lot of indigenous vocabulary is mixed into that dictionary. Colloquial terms, forms of spelling. These things were not really well developed. A family name could have 3 or 4 different spellings at this time. So they wanted to try to organize everything in a cohesive package, and that was the goal. So America is coming into its own not only literary style, but vocabulary and form of expression. And that takes place, really see that after 1812. So the story of Keesh is written in the third person limited omniscient. And the narrator tells the story through the eyes of Keesh and refers to him in the third person, he or she. The author is not a character in the story. Reveals the thoughts of one main character, Keesh, and doesn't have access to the thoughts so much of the other characters in the story, so it's limited. And but he really sees everything that's going on in Keesh's mind. So it's as if the author is up here looking down, or the narrator is up here looking down, trying to see and observe everything that's going on. So that's a little of the third person limited omniscient. So let's talk about some of the, I wouldn't call it the main theme, we're getting there, but some of the sub-themes of the story. Definitely man versus nature. This is survival, cold, climate, resources that are limited. They're not going down to the local supermarket to buy their food. There's some talk in the story about superstition and witchcraft. Keesh is definitely questioning authority, going to the tribal elders with his complaints and his plans. And he definitely had to overcome adversity. So these are some of the minor themes of the story. And next we're going to take a look at the main theme. So the main theme in the story is sacrifice, which is forgotten. So Keesh really wants his father's memory to be honored and restored. First, his father was a great provider for the village, tribal elder. He goes out, he gets killed hunting by a bear. And very quickly the community forgets the heroic and sacrifice of his father. Keesh and his mother end up in the poorest igloo in the village. I guess you could say they were kind of on type of welfare. They got their food provided by others, and it usually was the poorest quality of meat, lots of bones and fatty and not much meat on it. They were really struggling. So this is really the motivation behind Keesh for first going to the tribal council and complaining, which really isn't done, to the point where he goes out and he starts hunting and providing food not only for himself, for the village as a whole, but like his father, he made sure that those that couldn't or didn't have the resources were given it and given good quality food. So sacrifice, which is forgotten, is probably the major theme of the story. Okay, so let's do a quick overview of the story. The story starts off, describes Keesh and his mother's living situation, poorest in the village, gets tired of eating the scraps, goes to the council and makes a speech, complains about the quality of the food, doesn't show the proper respect of commonplace in a meeting or a form of meeting. He gets thrown out of the council meeting, and he says, "Okay, I'm cool with that because I'm not coming back." So he goes back to his igloo, grabs his father's hunting spear, and goes out hunting. 3 days go by. Keesh doesn't show up. A snowstorm had come through. They've given him up for dead. He finally shows up. Big pile of meat. Feasts. Him and his mother have some good fresh meat to eat. He's exhausted. Sleeps for 24 hours. Goes back out hunting again. And he tells the tribal members that if you go down the road, there's another big pile of meat there. Go get it. He goes out hunting again on his own. Brings back a big pile of fresh meat, bear meat. People in the village are starting to talk. This kid is pretty successful. He's really hunting in the most dangerous way. Killing a bear is dangerous, but killing a mother with its cub is probably the most dangerous hunting food source in all of the Arctic. He seems to be able to do this several times with no problems. The community's thinking, well, how is he doing this? Does he have some supernatural powers? Is this witchcraft? Again, the superstition plays into the story. Finally, the chief sends a couple of other hunters to follow him, to spy on him and see what he's doing. And they come back and they say, well, he's we don't know what he's doing really, but it looks like he's kind of running up to the bear and throwing these little round balls down on the ice, and the bear chases after Keesh, but stops and eats those little balls of food. Keesh runs and hides. A couple hours later, the bear is sick and in pain, can't defend itself. Keesh goes in for the kill, and now he's got a big pile of meat. But they really can't. What's this hunting method? What's this situation going on? So Keesh comes back. He's got the big pile of meat. They invite him to come back into the council meeting, kind of corner him and say, "Hey, what are you doing? How are you able to do this?" So he explains that what he's doing is he's getting the bear's attention, and he has prepared these small balls of fat and meat that are frozen, and inside he puts a whale bone. So he lures the bear to the food. The bear eats it. As the food is in the bear's stomach, it starts to thaw and to melt. And that little bone, that whale bone that's in the ball of food, expands. Very sharp points on it. It makes the bear very sick, unable to defend itself. And Keesh goes in and finishes him off for the food. So he doesn't lie about the method that he uses. Keesh becomes kind of the most important person in the village. He gets the respect that he's seeking. He's providing for his mother, and he's also doing just like his father did. He made sure that all of those who couldn't provide for themselves had good quality food. He finally becomes the chief of the tribe, and that's where our story concludes. So one of the concepts that we see running through literature from the past up into even Jack London's story of Keesh is that of what's called the noble savage. And the noble savage in literature is an idealized concept that the uncivilized man symbolizes the innate goodness of one not exposed to the corruption and influences of civilization. Sounds good on the surface, but this is a very limiting concept. First Nations peoples today that review the literature of the past consider this a form of racism. Because what it's really saying is, well, first, who decides what's civilized or not? Okay. Do you have to invent the wheel? Do you have to have written language? Do you have to have certain protocols and forms of politeness to be civilized? Okay, so that's one. But it also limits that indigenous person from ever being able to live or work or under the influences of civilization. Is it possible to be both? And as we can see that, yes, in today's contemporary society, we have people who are traditional in their indigenous values and yet have full-time jobs and college degrees. And we're going to talk about that a little more. But we're getting to the point in our overview of American literature and First Nations literature in a more contemporary view, talks more and more about these changes from the traditional riding a painted pony across the plains hunting buffalo up to what modern life is like today. Okay, so this pretty much concludes our story, Jack London's story, Keesh. But before we leave on our next plane trip to Kansas, I'd like to read a song. I'm definitely not going to sing it. That comes from the Inuit people. Now, Keesh and those indigenous peoples that live in the far north, from Alaska all across northern Canada into Greenland and even northern Russia, are called the Inuit people. And this is a song that a shaman or a medicine man would sing, translated into English. And it's called Magic Words. And this kind of sums up our some of the belief systems of the Inuit people. So here we go. In the very earliest times, when both people and animals lived on Earth, a person could become an animal if he wanted to, or an animal could become a human being. Sometimes we were people, and sometimes animals, and there was no difference. All spoke the same, the universal tongue. It was a time when words were like magic. The mind had mysterious powers, and a word uttered by chance might have consequences. It would suddenly become alive, and what people wanted to happen could happen. All you had to do was say it. Nobody could explain this. That's just the way it was. Okay, so the native peoples, indigenous peoples, really had a sense of superstition and supernatural powers, especially dreams. We're going to talk about that a little later, and spoken word. So one had to be very careful about what they said. It had consequences. If you say it, it could happen. This is part of a universal indigenous cultures believe in the power of what is spoken out into the wind. If it goes out into the wind, it could happen. Okay, so that's our little song, Unsung, on magic words. So we move on to our next story, Tanayika, and we find out that this story is 100% total fiction in every aspect. The title, Tanayika, is supposed to be an indigenous ceremony where you have to go out into the wilderness for 5 days and survive with nothing but a knife. There is no such ceremony anywhere in the indigenous world. So even the title of the story is fiction. The story was written in 1972. The author is Mary Whiteheart. Sounds indigenous to me. Well, come to find out that this is a pseudonym or pen name of a writer who's had an interest in Native American Indians in the 20th century. But she is not a she. She is a he, and he is not Native American. So I don't know how much more fiction you can get than that. So it tells in the story about the end of the Kaw people in Kansas, a tribal group that died out, supposedly died out. Well, no, that's not true either. The Kaw people still exist today. So here we have a story that is absolute, total fiction in every possible manner. But it's an interesting transition from the realism of Jack London's writing style. We're moving into a contemporary form of fiction. If fiction does mean not true, I guess they took that to every possible point they could in this story. But anyway, the themes that the story talks about is, again, man versus nature, survival, coming of age, okay, from the transition from childhood to adulthood, old versus new. This is a very common theme in contemporary First Nations literature today. Changing times, absolutely true. And it suggests that our hero of the story is resourceful or deceitful. It's really left up to the reader to decide that. And should the ceremony be redone is another question that comes up at the end of the story. The story of Tanayika, we'll do a quick summary overview, starts off with the grandfather teaching the granddaughter and grandson how to survive in the wilderness. They have a rites of passage coming up, and he's preparing them for that ceremony. So one of the first things that he teaches them to do, surviving in the wilderness, is to find food. The berries, the nuts, the roots, even talking about eating grasshoppers. When I was in Japan, I tried some chocolate-covered grasshoppers. They were a little crunchy, no taste, but I wouldn't do it again. So anyway, they're kind of disgusted by it all. The two grandkids, they're definitely not going to be eating grasshoppers. So Mary, our heroine, comes up with another plan. She goes to the local school teacher and asks to borrow $5. Kind of hedges around the real reason what she needs the money for. But she says that she'll pay the school teacher back by babysitting. So she gets her $5. It's the day of the ceremony. Her brother and she go into the wilderness. They take two different paths. They're in their bathing suits and they have a knife, and they have to survive for the next 5 days. So her plan is to go down to the river. She goes down to the marina where there are boats, and her plan is to sleep at night on one of the boats. Well protected, out of the weather, nobody's around, she'll be safe. So she goes down to the marina and there's no boats. They're all gone. Now what is she gonna do? So she sees down the road a restaurant, Ernie's restaurant. She decides to go in and use her $5 to buy some food. So of course she buys a typical tween or young teen meal, a hamburger and a milkshake. So she goes to the restroom. She sees a window that's partially open. So she makes sure that it's usable for later. She comes out, finishes her meal, goes outside. She waits for the owner, Ernie, to leave and go home. And then she sneaks in the bathroom window and carves out a nice spot on the floor for herself. She finds a radio, turns the radio on, has some tunes, feeling comfortable. The floor's kind of hard, but better than sleeping outside under a tree. She falls asleep, oversleeps. Suddenly, she hears a voice. The owner, Ernie, has come back the next day and says, "Hey, what are you doing? Who are you? What's going on here?" So Ernie knows by looking at her that she's from the Indian reservation up the road. And she tells Ernie the story of the ceremony called Tanayika. And Ernie's kind of appalled, a little appalled by how could you send kids out to do something like that? So he kind of takes care of Mary, goes into the closet, finds some old clothes for her. She is nice and warm. She can put the clothes together and make a more comfortable sleeping area for herself, and tells her that she can stay at the restaurant for the duration of the ceremony, which she does. So she sleeps there at night, and during the day she goes out into the nearby meadow and field. She picks some flowers, brings them back to the restaurant, and makes a table display for all the tables in Ernie's restaurant. Kind of a way to, help out and kind of pay for her board and room, so to speak. But Ernie's kind of a nice guy, and he teaches her how to make omelets and something called Ernie's chili. Okay, so I don't know if you know what chili is. It's kind of a Tex-Mex, a Mexican Texas food, a little spicy, beans and beef. People have contests for chili all over the United States. So it's basically American food. So, she's doing pretty good. She's comfortable, out of the weather, well fed. He doesn't take any more money from her. The 5 days are up. She returns home, walks in the door, looking pretty as a picture. sees her brother lying on the couch, mosquito bitten, swollen face, dirty, red, exhausted. She looks like she just got up, from a regular night of sleeping. And Grandma and Grandpa are looking at her, wondering, where have you been? What have you been doing? Well, she doesn't lie. She tells the truth that she found a place to stay in a restaurant and kind of worked for her keep, picking flowers, and that's where she was for the 5 days. So they kind of, you really didn't quite do the ceremony correctly. Maybe you should do it again. Okay, and then the grandfather has a little, at the very end of the story, he makes a very interesting statement, and we'll get there on the next slide. But just as a side note, okay, so if you did that today with kids between the ages of I think they're 11 to 14 years of age, you'd be arrested. The police would be knocking on your door. That's child endangerment. You can't send a kid out for 5 days in the wilderness in a bathing suit and a knife and try to survive to make a transition into adulthood. So I think maybe, if you saw the movie 300 about the Greeks at Thermopylae, Sparta, yeah, okay. 2,000 years ago in Sparta, they might have done something like that. But 1972, absolutely not. Okay, so we'll get to what the grandfather says at the end of the story, which is really poignant for what's going on in First Nations transitioning from the traditional to today. So at the end of the story, the grandfather, thinking about it, should she have to take the test again, or did she really cheat, or what have you? So he thinks about it for a while, and he comes up with this final paragraph. And in it he says, "The grandfather said, 'But I think you are more alert to what is happening to our people today than we are. I think you would have passed the test at any time. Somehow you know how to exist in a world that wasn't made for Indians.'" So, okay, she passes the test. She doesn't have to do a redo or do the test again. And it makes a very important statement about contemporary First Nations peoples today. Yes, on the reservations, Native peoples try to renew their traditional lifestyle. But in today's world, it's an overwhelming task. You could see that in one of the earlier videos about Alaska, the struggle of that community trying to maintain a traditional subsistence lifestyle. And yet the world has progressed forward. This is a daunting task to try to maintain a total lifestyle in the traditional sense. So what do we really have today? What's going on today with First Nations peoples? So most First Nations peoples don't live on those reservations. Maybe about 25% live on the reservations today. The other 75% live all across America, urban areas, rural areas. They go to college. They get regular jobs. You wouldn't really know where they're from or unless you asked. So today we have an astronaut that's First Nations. We have several government officials that are First Nations. In the state of Iowa, there's a woman named Paulette Jordan. She was the governor of Iowa First Nations, now running for a Senate seat representing Iowa in the 2020 election. We can see a real contrast in life in even the last 50 years in the two photos on the right. So the black and white photo is of that older woman 50 years ago, dressed in caribou made clothing, handmade. Caribou is a kind of deer living out in a rural community in Alaska. And here she is today, 50 years later, wearing store-bought clothes, okay, riding in looks like a bus or a van, and not a dog sled. And this is the world of iPods and computers and cell phones, and quite a transition in the last 50 years for those rural communities. Now, Jack London was one of the people that actually saw First Nations peoples living in their traditional lifestyle. Shortly after London's time, progress moves on. It's the Industrial Revolution. The First Nations peoples were pushed off their land and sent onto reservations, confining them into areas. They became kind of a welfare state dependent on the federal government for housing, food, etc. Eventually, through time up to today, those reservations have found that some of the land that the colonial powers moved them to actually had oil, and they were able to turn those revenues into a much better community situation. But that was not the rule. Okay, that was just isolated events. Some of the First Nations, especially up here this way in New England, have turned to gambling casinos, and they've turned their small rural communities into huge entrepreneurial enterprises backed by gambling casinos. So this is kind of a taste of what's going on today. And as we move forward from this story, we're going to get on the airplane and we're going to fly to present day Hawaii, some contemporary poems, and that's what we'll be discussing next. So as a wrap up to our stories to this point, the issue about fitting into the modern day society and where are First Nations peoples today compared to the past. So First, we talked earlier about the population of First Nations peoples before European contact. And of course, if you ask First Nations peoples, they would say that the number of people living in America, or also known as Turtle Island, was the same as today, so about 300 million people. But the statistics from the European at the time of contact say as maybe 100 million to as little as 12 million. Today, the population of First Nations peoples in continental USA and Alaska is about 4 million people. So no matter how you look at it, which statistic you want to use, the population has been decimated. So Robert Kennedy, brother to JFK, Attorney General to the United States, was a big proponent of First Nations, Indigenous peoples' rights, treaty rights, their social welfare, living conditions. And he would visit the tribes, and he would make speeches. So one of his more famous speeches that he made, he quotes verbatim the paragraph from Benjamin Franklin's remarks about sending the 6 Native boys to an American college. He recites that verbatim in his speech. He ends his speech with this very poignant phrase. He says that the first Americans have become the last Americans. And he, in his speech, he recites some of the living conditions presently. We see that the average lifespan in some of the tribes is only about 45 years of age, about 10 years or more less than the average American. A high incidence of suicide among Native American males, 50% greater than the general population. The most serious problem facing Native Americans today is alcohol abuse. And we look at some of the other statistics. There's a great research website called Pew, P-E-W. They do statistical analysis and demographics, mostly American. So if you're into that sort of thing, that's a great resource, Pew, P-E-W. So they talk about things like 15% of First Nations young people never finish high school, much higher than the national average. Fewer still go to college. And generally, again, the health statistics, diabetes is a big issue. And recently, with the COVID-19, on the reservation, the Navajo reservation in New Mexico, Arizona area, has the highest per capita incident of COVID-19 cases of anywhere in the United States. So these are some of the issues that contemporary First Nations authors write about in their stories present day. Is this a struggle between the old traditional values and lifestyle and coming to grips with modern day society? So we're getting ready to fly over to Hawaii. And again, just a quick recap on that. Hawaii is probably the most multicultural, multi-ethnic state in the United States. Up to 25% of the population is multiracial. And these four women poets talk about their struggle with those issues. So we're here in Hawaii today. Hope you're enjoying the weather. Beautiful, sunny, 80 degrees, low humidity, great place. If you ever have a chance to hop on an airplane and go to Hawaii, highly recommend it. It is a beautiful place. So we're going to be talking about our four Hawaiian women poets. And the first one is Puani Burgess. What we notice about these four women, what they all have in common, aside from being and coming from Hawaii, is that they are all activists in Hawaii concerning Hawaiian Indigenous sovereignty and rights. So our first poetress, Puani Burgess, she is, her poem is about her names, the names that she was giving growing up. And her three names were Kristen Bell, Yoshi, and Puani. And she is of mixed ancestry, mostly Japanese and Hawaiian, along with some other European mix. And again, you see this in Hawaii. It's quite common to see these multi-racial people, up to 25%. So she talks about growing up, and at the time, it wasn't cool to be Japanese because the Second World War had just ended. And being Hawaiian was also kind of negative in their cultural way. I don't know why. I mean, you're from Hawaii, you should be Hawaiian, but nevertheless. She talks about her, Kristen Bell was her English name, my social security card name, my school name, the name I gave when teachers asked for my real name, a safe name. Okay, so again, I really like the way that she just kind of put that out there so simply. But then again, you have to, what is a real name? Okay. Her second name was a Japanese name, Yoshi. And that was the name that she was called around the house by her family. And even though she looked, partially Japanese, she didn't look totally Japanese. So, and she talks about, I think she talks about her grandmother who was Hawaiian, and of darker color skin. And I guess they made a lot of comments about that, even within the family. So she finally, after time goes by, and she grows up, she finally decides her Hawaiian name as her chosen name. And a couple of the vocabulary words that were in the poem, Hawaiian. So piko is considered the navel, the belly button, for lack of a better word, where life begins. And it represents tranquility and spirituality, regrowth, and new beginnings. Ana is the love of the land. Now, this theme of love of land, the land as mother, the nurturer, the provider of food and medicine and water and all the things that humans need to survive. It's a very common thread, not only in native Hawaiian culture, but throughout indigenous cultures around the world. Very much connected to the land and the preservation of land. And Poe Kahiko talks about the ancestors, which is another very common thread throughout all indigenous literature, is the connection to ancestors. And in fact, the traditional way of introducing oneself, even to a new friend, but not to a new friend, but to a group, you would never start out by saying, I am. You would start out by saying who your ancestors were, and you would talk about them. And in many ways, in First Nations culture, it's impolite to refer to I, myself. So try to say a few sentences about yourself without using the word I or me. It's really difficult, but a totally different cultural reflection. So there is a short video that I'll put in the box below the YouTube, in the description box. And the first 5 minutes, just take a look at the first 5 minutes of it. It's kind of lengthy, but she talks about this whole naming issue that she faced growing up in Hawaii. So our next poem is from Mahalani Perez Windit. It's called Hawaiian Mother. And in the poem, she starts off talking about something called a dream catcher. You can see a picture of that over on the top left. And this is a Native American, you'd call it kind of an amulet or a protection device, for lack of a better word. You would hang this maybe on your doorway outside your bedroom or above you where you sleep. And what its intention is to capture your dreams, that when you're dreaming at night. Because they believe that dreams have power. And if it's a good dream, you want to capture it. And if it's a bad dream, foretelling bad luck or bad situations, you definitely want to capture that, because you don't want that going out into the air or into the wind, because it has power, and that bad dream could happen. So she uses a lot of analogy describing her Hawaiian mother in the symbols of Hawaiian mythology and culture. The green sea turtle is a symbol for good luck, and it's a guardian spirit. And she talks about her mother going with her father, who was a holy man, to the volcanoes to pray. And yet, in a non-traditional sense, her mother spoke English very well, knew about American culture. The Dorsey brothers are a famous jazz band from the late 40s. And she talks about the power of the volcano and Hawaii as a Garden of Eden. Okay, so she really connects her mother with the traditional symbols of Hawaii. She mentions that her mother kind of developed an edge. And when you develop an edge, you become hard or hardened to life's realities. Okay, so Mahalina is mixed ancestry, Hawaiian and Spanish. And she too is also an activist in Hawaiian native cultural sovereignty and rights. So our next poet is Tamara Wong Morrison, and her poem is Maha Ulepu, and it really talks about the natural beauty of Hawaii, but as so-called progress comes to the Hawaiian Islands, these natural beauty places turn into urban development. And she talks about the loss of the natural world, the natural beauty, change, again, another theme that's very prevalent in contemporary Indigenous literature. And as you can see, and this happens not only in Hawaii, but all around the world, all of these beautiful natural beauty sites, developers will come in, buy up the whole mountain or the seacoast, and start throwing up these ugly hotels and shopping malls. And this is so-called progress. Again, Tamara is an activist in Hawaiian native cultural rights. And even today, there are protests for different development projects that are going on throughout the islands of Hawaii. So our final poem by Jamaica, let's try this one here. Hiolaima Le Kalani is entitled My Last Painful Prayer. And she is the youngest of the four poets. And she is of mixed ancestry. It looks possibly Spanish and Hawaiian. And she was at the White House giving a performance for President Obama. And she's won several awards for her work. So the poem is really a struggle of her own identity. She talks a lot about skin, shades of skin color. She is more European looking than Hawaiian, and yet she wants to be more Hawaiian. She talks about her ancestry coming from Kamehameha. Kamehameha was the ruler of Hawaii during colonial times. She also talks about being coming from Captain Cook. Captain Cook was a British navigator who explored the South Pacific, had been to Hawaii several times, ended up being killed there over some stolen piece of metal or some small little trinket that everybody got in a twist about. So she has a real identity crisis going on for herself, wishing to look and be more Hawaiian than she appears. There's also a part of the poem that talks about religious conflict of her grandmother, who she loved. And her grandmother was a Christian, a very devoted Christian. And yet Jamaica wants to practice the religion of the native Hawaiians. It's kind of an interesting twist of a poem. The identity crisis is one of not looking more Hawaiian rather than trying to fit in. So these are this is the conclusion of the 4 poems from Hawaii. And next we're going to talk about our next week's reading assignment. Okay, so our final First Nations story is by Joseph Bruchac, and it's called Skins. And Joseph is of a mixed Native American Indian ancestry from the Abenaki tribe, which is from Maine to northern New York State. And I believe he's also Lithuanian ancestry as well. So his stories, he's quite a famous, prolific author. His most famous story is called Bright Path, and it's the story of a First Nations football player from the early days of football, and his name was Jim Thorpe. Now, Jim Thorpe is considered the best and most famous athlete in all of American history. So if you're into sports, here's the story to read. When you go to, I think it's in New York, upstate New York, Football Hall of Fame. When you walk into through the front door, you see a huge statue dedicated to Jim Thorpe. Quite an amazing story. So Joseph's story, Skins, takes place in a rural community in upstate New York. And it's about 3 young boys of multi-racial ethnic backgrounds that are in an all-white school. and the story revolves around that situation. Um, it's not so negative in terms of the interrelationships of the students and the boys. It's the difficulty arises between themselves. A lot of twists and turns in the story. It's a fairly quick read. Not some nuanced vocabulary that we'll talk about that's specific to American culture, but I think you can find your way through it relatively quickly and easily. So that's our just a real quick introduction to our story Skins, and I hope you enjoy reading it.